Start running up the road. We see the guys. We got eyes on. We were about to gain on them. And then a loud explosion goes off. Turns out there was like 80 pounds of HME, that's homemade explosive, underneath that bridge. Looking back at it, I was like, I could not explain what happened, what took place. And I struggled with survivor's guilt. And on this particular day, I was dead set of like taking my own life. Something has its hands in humanity.
This is
Disruption.
I decided to go full podcaster energy with like the phone net kind of thing, you know?
Yeah.
Look like some kind of
we call
hipster.
that the
It's the
German heritage.
Yeah, it's the liberal German professor outfit.
Yeah.
Like I studied
turtleneck.
theology.
German higher
and
criticism?
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's this outfit right here.
You call Barth over here?
That's right.
You just need a little.
I'm not liberal.
Oh, you got glasses too?
I'm neo-orthodox.
Neo-orthodox,
not liberal.
yeah.
Don't say mean things about me. I technically believe in Jesus. Come on, guys.
Technically. Which the audience?
You were a megachurch Baptist.
By the time this episode comes out, those episodes will already be out. But I was already kind of being inundated with that idea, like in marketing or in online, whatever. And even it's somehow related to what I was also being taught in church production, was kind of like when you teach anything, even in Christianity, you're trying to reach the masses. It's gotta all be super basic, or it's got to be like shallow so that it applies to everybody. Mm-hmm. But I don't know. That's just what I was learning.
It's the dumbing down of society.
Right. Yeah.
And the church is falling into the same traps.
Yeah. Kind of like.
And it's no longer becoming like an intellectually formidable force. Mm-hmm. So then it gets laughed at. I laughed at it as an atheist. Mm-hmm. So it happens.
Yeah.
You'd be like, what am I going to go there for? I think I'll feel stupider if I go for, like legitimately, you're just like, I feel like I'm not getting smarter being here, but actually like dumbing myself down.
Right.
There have been times when I've been listening to Christian radio, and I've been thinking, I wonder if I'd be a better Christian if I stopped listening to Christian radio.
Dude, yeah, probably.
It's like, this isn't exactly high caliber stuff necessarily all the time. I mean, I don't want to be overly critical and throw everybody under the bus, but sometimes it's kind of like,
I don't think it's being overly critical. I think it's just being realistic. I think the reason why Christians refer to everything as overly critical is because they're also easily offended.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, 1 Corinthians 13 says, being easily offended is not love and is sinful. Love does not become easily offended.
Yeah.
Like, just try that being married. Easily offended. I think, like, all these, so many Christians are, like, don't have that double standard. Where it's like, they talk about all the time in church culture. Yep. Like, we just want to be so gracious so as to not offend and not put stumbling blocks.
Yeah.
They say that in the church culture, but their marriage is not like that. If they tried doing that with their wives, oh my goodness, your marriage would come to a screeching halt. You would be in counseling right there with your wife, and she would be trying to be like, I feel like, okay, maybe I get too emotional and that offends him, but I feel like I just can't even say anything, and there's no room for my emotions at all. Yeah. And that's what's going to happen. And it's going to feel like the one who's easily offended or always offended and being like a Karen is just being like controlling and overbearing in their own way.
Welcome to the Disruption Podcast, everybody. I'm your host, Alex Sikma, here with my other host,
Stefan Walicord.
And today we brought on another special guest. Matthew Reyes is here with us today. I met Matthew I think it was at 7th Reformed, first time I met you.
Yeah.
Wait, I got the description right here. I got it right here. Hold on. Okay. Ex-Catholic, ex-atheist, ex-Pentecostal, dropped out of Hogwarts School of Supernatural Sciences. And he's with us here today at a Reformed church. Wow, who knew?
That's going to be such a great clickbait thumbnail and title. It's going to be world class. It's like ex-Pentecostal, atheist, pagan, veteran is going to be like converts to Reformed Christianity.
I forgot to say that in there. Ex-Satanist. I forgot to put that in there.
You got to put the whole thing in there. It's going to be a fantastic description.
Yeah. And so anyway, so we want to unpack that story a little bit. How did that whole conversion process happen? And then if you guys would have remembered a few weeks ago, or probably a couple months ago, we did an episode with Dr. Kelderman on biblical counseling, kind of retrace our steps on that topic. Yeah. Basically talking about secular counseling and does it work? Does secular counseling work? No.
Well, we have a Case study right here for you.
We have an actual case study. And basically, yeah, and just I think a really exciting story overall. So we just want to unpack that story here on the podcast today. So yeah, so tell us about your upbringing in the household situation you're brought up in, and why did you join the military, and just kind of start off at that point.
Yeah, no problem. So grew up in California to young parents, teenage parents. I grew up in a very traditional Mexican family, very Catholic, up until middle school age. Around that time is when suffering came. And when suffering came, the typical, battle, the struggle happened. Like, how do you answer and how do you reconcile the problem of suffering and God's existence? Right? Growing up in the Catholic Church, I wasn't taught how to deal with suffering. So when that came into my life, that challenged all my assumptions about who God is and about my faith at the time, the Catholic faith. And so that led me to just leave faith altogether, or what faith I claimed to have. And so that's when I came to full-on atheism and just said, you know what? There cannot be a God because there isn't a legitimate answer to the problem of suffering. That was probably when I was about 11 years old. And after that, I became increasingly hardened to the things of faith, increasingly hardened to scripture, to God's existence. Didn't want to hear it, didn't want to be evangelized, nothing. It's just, from that point on, I really just did harden my heart. And I was just like, you know what? If God doesn't exist, there's nothing to really believe in. It's just kind of whatever you make out of life. Pretty much held that view until I did come to faith. But how I came to join the military, never really thought about the military. I did think about law enforcement, and so that's not that far of a leap, but didn't really think about the military per se until junior year of high school. I was 16 years old. There was 2 other friends in my high school. We were all talking about joining the Army. Mm-hmm. And then for one reason or another, looking back now, I can say it's just God's divine providence. But at the time, there was no real explanation, especially for my atheistic worldview. But we were all just talking, and we were just like, we should all join the Army. But it wasn't one of those things like, let's join the Army so we can get college benefits. It's like we actually believed in the mission that was going on overseas. So I ended up joining the Army at 17, went to boot camp, joined as a airborne infantry. That's just a fancy way to say it's like you jump out of planes and fight on the ground.
Is that the same thing as a paratrooper?
Yeah, that's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you get paid a little extra for jumping out of a perfectly good airplane.
Hey, it's better than jumping out of an airplane in bad shape. That's usually a worse sign.
And so that was kind of like my background. I had Catholicism is how I was raised, turned away from Catholicism, embraced atheism, and stayed atheistic all throughout the military. And in the military, pretty much everyone's atheist. If not atheist, then agnostic, definitely not religious.
Sure.
I probably met less than a handful of Christians my entire 10 years in the Army.
What do you think is the thing driving that military atheism? Is it that's the kind of people who it appeals to, or that's a weird intersection, because I think traditionally the way it's been described is like the people who go to the military are like the good patriotic Christian American whatever. Like the way that you're describing it, largely atheist agnostic, doesn't sound like the same thing, right? What do you think's the driving force behind that? Typically,
at least what I've seen, is that most Christian churches and most in Christian culture do not like the violence that comes with being in the military. And I think so that's one thing why you're not going to get flocks of Christians joining law enforcement and military. There's a lot that can be said about that, but theologically, there's nothing wrong with military and law enforcement, or you can affirm Christians serving in either, right? Absolutely. Yeah. But maybe that just doesn't translate well. And another thing is the military culture is a very rough culture. And so then in that sense, it probably attracts a lot of people with rough backgrounds. In fact, that's exactly what I saw. I was coming from a rough background where growing up in these Mexican neighborhoods, all my family members, the men at least, were all involved in gangs. In elementary school, I remember being like in 5th and 6th grade, getting involved in gang activity and stayed in gangs, and that increased in middle school and in high school. I eventually dropped out of high school running around with gangs and didn't care about high school. But then at the same time, even though I'm over here in gangs, I have this appeal, this pull to join the military. So it was very weird. That doesn't typically happen.
It's an interesting culture.
You're like
clash.
running away from the law enforcement, but at the same time, you're like, I'm going to be in the military.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that is interesting.
Yeah.
So it's like, you know, most people, if they're involved in gangs, they don't join the military unless it's court ordered.
But government makes you.
In my case, I
That's
volunteered.
wild.
I volunteered.
Yeah.
And I remember, you know, being like 11 years old, 12 years old when 9/11 happened. It was like, if you were old enough, everybody remembers. And it was like a pivotal, life-changing day to think like, man, you know what? Like this kind of violence can happen like at a moment's notice. Aside everything that was going on, having like an existential crisis and becoming atheist, being involved in gangs and gang violence, there's still this desire to want to do something about this thing that's happening overseas, this war, a desire for serving some greater purpose,
Yeah.
right? The greater good. And that's kind of how I saw it. I always had
Interesting.
a appeal to help people, even, which is weird because here I am running around with gangs, doing a lot of immoral activities, but at the same time, always defending people in neighborhoods and in the community. It was typically us as a high school gang stopping bullying. To us, it really made sense because that's kind of like what the gang was about,
Yeah.
so to speak. Yeah. So I guess there was kind of like somewhat of an easy transition to go from that kind of mindset, like to help people, want to defend people, want to stop evil, and then that just translates to like, well, I can stop evil on a bigger picture,
Yeah.
on a bigger scale. And that's what the military is.
Even though to some extent at that point you had lost your sense of evil from a like religious sense, you couldn't really say this was immoral because it broke God's law, but you still knew that it was wrong.
Right.
And you still wanted to stop it. Do you think to some extent there was a level where you're almost substituting your kind of the lost religious sense of right and wrong with other activities? Do you think that there was an element of that going on there?
I think that's always the case. If you throw God out the window and you throw out the moral foundation or the basis for which to have, you know, morality, you're going to create it and you'll make up your own moral rules.
Yeah. Because you don't become an amoral person.
Right.
You just become a person who doesn't have a foundation for morality, so you got to pick something else. Yeah.
Yeah, anyone who thinks that there's no such thing as objective morality, I mean, just cut them off on the freeway.
Yeah.
And then you'll see the injustice, right? Still their
Yeah.
wallet then. you know?
Unbelievable. Unbelievable. That
Right.
meaningless clump of cells would cut off this meaningless clump of cells on this meaningless thing that we call a highway. Something is desperately wrong with
Yeah.
the world.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And so there is a swap. It's like, so even if I'm not going to believe in God and I'm not believing in God because of some life and existential crisis, and I jettison God, you don't jettison morality.
No, you
don't
don't.
jettison your innate sense of like justice and injustice.
Mm-hmm.
It may be skewed because now you don't have the biblical moral foundation.
Yeah. You don't have basis for it, but
Right. So it's skewed, but it's still there, right? And you'll make up and substitute your own. And so I definitely still had that sense of justice, and that's one thing that drove me to want to join the military.
Okay, so you're in the military now. You're still an atheist. And what is that environment like just before you start? Because I want to get to also like what was that point where your wheels are starting to turn
Yeah.
about this Christianity thing. But before we get to that, what is the environment in the military like?
If you're an atheist, you're at home. You're at home in the military because that's definitely a challenging aspect of being a man or woman of faith in the military. It's not faith friendly at all. I mean, it could be changed now, but it definitely wasn't. You had a bunch of guys, and I was in an all-male unit. So I served in a special operations unit. So I was in 2nd Ranger Battalion, which is a U.S. Army Special Operations unit. And U.S. Army Rangers, their main thing is direct action raids and special reconnaissance. So the best way to explain that culture is you got a bunch of younger guys who serve as the lower enlisted, led by a bunch of combat hardened, combat experienced older guys. And by older, I mean like 25 to 28. That's
Right,
considered like
yeah.
older in that environment. The actual older guys, and what they instilled in special operations is something called quiet professionalism.
Yeah.
Where it's not about bragging rights, right? I'm gonna poke fun at the Marines. Don't act like a Marine. Be all loud and proud. Don't do that. That was frowned upon. There was a lot of, interesting enough, humility in that sense.
Interesting.
No boasting, no bragging. That's what quiet professionalism is. You let your action speak for itself. Essentially, don't be loudmouth.
Yeah.
But as far as like faith-wise, there's a lot of guys who have a mentality of, because maybe it's their kind of A-type personality, there is a lot of internal pride, internal like independence, where they're just like, I can do anything, I can accomplish anything, therefore I don't need God.
Yeah.
I don't need religion. I don't need all this spirituality. It's very much seen as like religion's for the weak-minded.
Yeah.
And so religion is for people who don't know how to cope with hardship and suffering.
Yeah.
And these guys, I mean,
They knew how to cope.
yeah, hard charging, hard fighting, a lot of stoicism, a lot of that kind of mentality. So there's like, I don't need that stuff. I can handle whatever life throws at me. So that kind of mentality. So I think there's a lot of that drove independence to the point of independence from God. That's how I saw it for myself too. It's like, why do I need that? Like I can take care of myself, deal with anything, do anything. So very much that mentality. I first got to Ranger Battalion after selection in 2008. And then when I got there, this is to give you a kind of a like idea of what the culture is like. I got there, my last name's Reyes, and you're greeted by like the senior NCOs there, which are like the leaders. And when they get a bunch of new guys who in process into their battalion. I think there was like 18 of us who showed up that day. And then they divvy you up into your companies and your respective platoons and teams and whatnot. And the guy looked at my last name and he was like, Reyes. He's like, what is that? Some kind of like Spanish or Mexican? He's like, you're probably a criminal. So he was like, you can go to Charlie Company because that's criminal company.
Oh my goodness.
So that's how I ended up in Charlie Company, which I love that company, by the way. But so that was like immediately like my first, impression of like, okay, this is how we do things. Like, all right. And then I get there to, criminal company. Then I get to my platoon. The platoon name was called the Mad Slashers. And I found out the story behind them being called the Mad Slashers was there was some history of years ago. It was like in 2005 before I joined. There was a bar fight, some Rangers downtown. The Rangers had a bunch of knives pulled out on them. They took the knives away. One guy got stabbed, still took the knife away. And they fought and beat up the other guys. And those guys ended up in the hospital. And then the commanding officer was like, what's going on with this platoon? What are they? A bunch of mad slashers fighting downtown? And so that was the nickname of the platoon. And the squad within the platoon was the Pagans. So you can kind of just like follow this along. I'm like in criminal company, the Mad Slashers, in Pagans, right? That was the squad nickname, the Pagans.
Yeah, they slotted you into exactly what they wanted.
Yeah,
that's wild.
It's kind of the war fighting culture.
Sure, yeah. It kind of makes sense when you send people of that age with that job to do that stuff. That's just what's going to develop. One
thing that I always found interesting as far as like the religious context is most of the people who were there, they did come from like hard backgrounds, like, hard knocks, right, type of life. But most of them came from also an atheistic or at least agnostic background. There was a few people who were like, I grew up in a Christian home, but I jettisoned that.
Yeah.
But it was interesting to see that most people didn't even come from a religious context at all. It was a purely secular atheistic context. And those are the people that wanted to enlist and join and fight. And if you're signing up for special operations, you know what you're getting yourself into. You didn't sign up for special operations so that you can sit behind a desk, so to speak. You knew exactly what you were getting into, and you wanted that.
So were you actually in the occult? Like, did you worship nature and stuff?
So I got into like Satanism. When you're in a squad where it's like the nickname is the Pagans, and there was already Satanists there, I think part of it is like this whole I can do whatever I want to do mentality, and that like naturally leads people into Satanism. Yeah. I mean, even today, like the Church of Satan or the Satanic Temple, which are two different but still under the same umbrella, their the motto is "Do what thou wilt," and so you have this mentality of like we'll do what we want. We don't need anybody or anything.
Yeah.
And so it kind of like is a natural breeding ground for that kind of prideful thinking. And
Is this the kind of Satanism that's basically atheism
Yeah.
with the post-Christian aesthetics? Or this isn't like the kind of atheism where you get like genuine like witchcraft, occult, people who actually believe in spirituality, just the wrong side, basically. This is more like the atheist kind of my will. Satan is an inspiration. He doesn't actually exist. Kind of my will be done kind of attitude, Satanism. It's, I think we've talked about this before, that C.S. Lewis made a comment about how the question is whether you want to breed materialists or like magicians. And his ideal is somebody who's actually both. He's an atheist and he still does the occult. And I'm very curious as the two branches of Satanism develop, like if you're ever going to get a crossover point where you develop a form of Satanism that is both atheist and super spiritualist.
Oh, right. We were talking about the screw tape letters and how that's interesting. Yeah. And then we say it coming up and we're like, oh, no.
That's an
Have the demons been
development.
reading this?
Yeah. Somebody's been reading the strategy guide.
it was definitely like a non-religious, non-spiritual.
Yeah.
There was a bit of like rebellion against God because a lot of us knew that we weren't good people, which is another thing I found interesting now being in Christ. Looking back, it's like everyone was willing to openly admit, yeah, if there is a heaven and if there is a God, I'm definitely not getting there because I know I'm not a good person.
Okay.
Which I found interesting because if you go ask the normal person on the street, especially in Grand Rapids, West Michigan, Bible Belt, Midwest, even if they haven't graced the church in the past 10 years, are you a good person? Oh, yeah, I am.
Good person.
And so in that sense, it's interesting, as hostile as we can be to the faith, there's a little bit more humility to say, and I know I'm not a good person. I know I would never be in heaven. And then yet people who are, I guess, less openly hostile are actually more hostile from their heart and would say, oh, I am a good person and I know that I'm worthy of heaven.
Yeah.
And God would be wrong to send me to hell because I know I'm good enough.
It's fascinating. They're like two opposite traps almost. It's like the trap of thinking that you're totally bad, but there's no God, so it's whatever.
Right.
Then the other side, there's there's a God, and I'm fine. I mean, both of them are very unbiblical. Both of them are attitudes that the gospel needs to break down. It's challenging because sometimes if you're in a very dynamic church, you're probably going to have to be ministering to both kinds of people, right? People who think they're great and people who are like, oh yeah, no, I don't need God kind of thing. But I admit that I'm not great. I work in manufacturing. You get a lot of people who work in manufacturing who are like, hardworking, rougher guys who are like, oh yeah, I'm awful, but I don't think there's a God to worry about or anything like that. And I'm kind of like, huh, interesting. That's not the usual response I'm used to hearing kind of thing. Yeah.
So at what point did your wheels start turning about the gospel? Were there some events that caused your PTSD? And then did those kind of like link up together, like you trying to seek out religion and the PTSD experience? Yeah, break that down for us.
Yeah, definitely. So, stayed hostile and atheist. I didn't even really like people praying for me. But what happened, this was a pivotal point in 2011 that didn't make me believe in God or even believe in his existence, but was enough to challenge my worldview, my atheism. And what happened is I was on my 5th deployment in 2011, 4th or 5th, I can't remember. And I was a team leader. I was a brand new team leader, which means as a team leader, it's you and you have charge of a 4-man team. And 2 4-man teams plus a squad leader who's in charge of those 2 4-man teams forms a squad. And so a team leader is a leader of one of those teams. And I was deployed to southern Afghanistan. I was in Kandahar. And if anyone knows anything about Kandahar, it's like IED central. Big vast majority of the IEDs and the IED deaths take place in this southern province of Afghanistan, Kandahar. It's also the main place where there's a production of opium. And so naturally you're going to have a large terrorist presence there. We're on typical mission. We did a lot of night raids. Pretty much all of our missions were night raids. And so the best way to explain it is like if you were like FBI SWAT, but at night, raiding homes. Every mission is a killer capture mission after high value targets to like disrupt terrorist networks over there. And we pretty much always fly in helicopters in the night, and then we land probably a couple hundred meters, so a few football fields away. Helicopter lands. You go running off the helicopter and you run towards your objective, your target building. And I'm leading, I'm going and I'm leading my team. And my task for that night was to establish like a security cordon and just kind of like guard off the objective so that nobody would run off the objective that we were trying to capture, or, you know, come into the objective and try to like ambush us or something. As we're running, I encounter like this stream. They have a lot of like running rivers through villages. That's how they get their water and stuff for the village. And there's like a bridge. Again, this is a high IED area, but we weren't told anything about any IEDs on the objective, so we were thinking, okay, we're fine, we're good. And as I'm running across this bridge, I stepped in something in the middle of the bridge that really like gave way. It was like squishy. I thought it was just like mud or maybe like some cow poo. And I was like, I thought to myself, like, man, I stepped in probably some cow poo or some mud, and now I got the stuff all over my boots, whatever. Right? It was super, like, there was something about it. The entire bridge was hard packed, except for this one spot. Continued on anyways. My team followed me. So we all, like, went across this bridge. Then we checked around the outside of the building. There was nobody. So, okay, it's all secure. And then I got called in to take my team and start clearing some rooms to help the main assault force. And as I'm going through, and I'm about to enter this room, and it's all under like night vision and stuff like that to kind of give us the element of surprise. And I had this weird feeling as I look at these rooms and the way they were set up, all the rooms were kind of like next to each other. And I'm looking through the windows and I'm looking through each door under like night vision. I'm shining my laser, and I could see just from the outside, everything is empty. And it was so quiet on the objective, which is not typical. There's typically lots of people on a compound. You have the men, you have lots of women, lots of children. You run into a lot of people. It's the middle of the night. A lot of people are sleeping. We didn't find a single soul. And the rooms were empty of even like basic furniture. No bedding on the floor, none of their rugs. And so I didn't go in to any room, which is not the typical MO. You go into each room and you clear it systematically. And I remember one of the squad leaders was like, why'd you go in the rooms? I was like, they're all empty. I can clear the room visually from the outside. And about that same time, I got a call over the radio that there was two guys running from the backside of the building in a field. Turns out they were laying there sleeping. So they go running, and so my team is tasked to go chase them down. So I have to run back out of the building and back across that bridge and along this parallel road and intercept them. And as I run across the bridge, right before I run across, I remember thinking, don't step in the middle because there was like mud or something, a bunch of gunk. So avoid that. But with the foot traffic, there was another squad passing me by. I was forced to like have to step dead center again. I was like, oh, are you kidding me? I'm going to step on this stuff again. It's going to be all over my boots. But, and something I couldn't explain, something grabbed me, and I thought it was one of my guys. But I looked and I turned over my right shoulder, and something grabbed me and just like shifted me diagonally so that I bypassed this center spot that I just stepped on the way back. And I turned, I was like, is one of my guys grabbing me? I'm like, he better not be. What's going on? And I turn over, and he's like 10 meters behind me, running, following me. And then every guy behind him, I'm like, and it probably looks so weird because I was running kind of like crooked diagonally. And it just made me miss this spot.
Wow.
It was weird. My guys see me, so they take the same path. And so we all four of us run. We go across the bridge successfully, start running up the road. We see the guys. We got eyes on. We were about to gain on them. And then a loud explosion goes off. And it turns out what was there is there was like 80 pounds of HME, that's homemade explosive, underneath that bridge. And it blew the whole thing like sky high. And what had happened is another one of our people had stepped on that. And what had happened was those guys that were in the field, when we watched the footage ever and just kept going over this whole, analyzing this mission, what happened, what went wrong, what could we have done? Those guys who were sleeping out in the field, which we couldn't see by surveillance because they're sleeping under all this overgrowth, they were waiting to ambush, and they had a command detonation wire from where they were sleeping all the way hidden underneath. And as soon as they heard us, they connected it to a power source. So when I originally crossed, what we saw after we played the footage, what I originally crossed and what I originally stepped on was the IED pressure plate. The pressure plate is two metal plates buried under the sand, so that when you step on it, the weight of a soldier with an operator with his kit on and everything, makes the two plates touch, completes the circuit, boom, blows up. It wasn't connected yet when I first stepped on it. You could see me through the surveillance footage from the birds in the sky. You could see me step on it. It was a hot spot, a thermal hot spot. You could see me step on it. But they were still sleeping. They hadn't connected it. But the second time when I was going to step on it again, it was active.
Yeah.
So had I actually stepped on it, but was stopped by what felt like a physical force, a hand on me, grabbed my shoulder, my right shoulder, and just shoved me to the side.
Yeah.
And my guys just followed my path because they're trained to just follow wherever I go.
Right.
And we got maybe about 100 meters away before it blew up from somebody else.
Wow.
There ended up being multiple casualties. 3 people were killed. There was like 12 casualties. Like 6 people were evacuated. It was like a whole mass casualty situation. And looking back at it, I was like, I could not explain it. What happened, what took place. And I struggled with survivor's guilt, and it was just like racking my brain for years. Yeah. But you don't have a lot of time to process things because, I mean, you are going out mission after mission after mission after mission. I was deploying every year. We're training back in the States, 7 months. We deploy for about 4 to 6 months, and then go back and repeat. And I did this for 10 years. That first incident was enough to question my worldview, my naturalistic, atheistic worldview. Couldn't explain that. How do you explain that from a naturalistic and atheistic worldview? You can't.
Yeah.
So I wasn't obviously a Christian. I didn't believe God exists, but I remember that year, it was October 2011, and I was like, you know what, God, if you exist, I'll be open. I won't fight if you show me. The typical atheist wager, you know?
Right, yeah.
That continued until another combat incident. I was that stubborn. I had this many combat incidents to keep rousing me and waking me up. There was another thing in 2012 where I had very close call. Yeah, 2012. So the following year, and I was like, through a bunch of crazy chaos that doesn't typically happen because we're very organized and systematic, but this was like just a chaotic night. Things got lost in translation. I got left in a room by myself while engaging the enemy, and like I made it out by like the skin of my teeth. And that had me question it too. So now you have these 2 incidents that just I cannot explain. At the same time, there was one of the Christians that was deployed with us. I had no idea he was a Christian, but he was explaining to me, and he would evangelize to me a little bit here and there. Yeah. At this point, we're both squad leaders, and he was just like, so he would just question and ask me questions like, why don't you believe, Reyes? Like, what are your biggest objections? And I would tell him and share some things. I'm like, yeah, I just can't believe in a God with all this kind of suffering. It's like, look at the world that we're in. Like, look at what we're doing. Look at our line of work. How is a God who's in charge of the universe, governing this universe, and we're faced with this? You know, not just terrorism, but the kind of stuff that happens overseas that most people don't know that happens apart from the terrorism. Like the maltreatment of Afghan citizens. When I mean maltreatment, I mean like maltreatment, like the way that terrorist networks and the Taliban would treat its own citizens was just like horrific. But he explained to me like he had certain experiences too that always affirmed his belief in God's existence. And when he would share these with me, I'm like, man, I had an experience just like that, like 2 deployments ago. And so now I'm hearing it from other people, and I'm like, oh, something has its hands in humanity apart from any of us. And it's just like, how do you explain this? So it had me at least kind of seeking and trying to figure it out at a minimum. But it wasn't until I started to struggle with PTSD. It was after my 9th deployment. I had 9 deployments in total. My last deployment was in 2015. And when I stopped deploying, oddly enough, that's when the PTSD started.
Because that's when you have time to start processing.
There you go. And so many veterans share this exact same experience. You stop deploying, things slow down. You're forced, no more compartmentalizing. You're forced to have to deal with everything you've experienced, all the things that you felt about it that you didn't have time to stop and think. Now here it all comes flooding in. And so at the same time, I'm struggling with PTSD. I'm having issues on the marital front. Right? I was married before my current wife. Back when I was an unbeliever, she was an unbeliever. And, you know, she was having an affair on my final deployment in 2015. So I have all these things all piling on me and don't have any way to deal with it. You know, a lot of veterans talk about this. That mental health PTSD battle is by far way more difficult than a typical combat battle. Yeah. Give me that. any day of the week
Yeah.
versus this, right? Problems on the marital front, problems with PTSD, like that's way more difficult. You can't just shoot that problem or blow it up.
Yeah.
That's
end it.
essentially
Oh,
what
yeah.
it's like.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
can't do anything with that. So what do you do with it? Struggling with PTSD is what led me down to like rock bottom. And that's where I started to really question myself versus questioning God. So it's interesting. Suffering in middle school led me to question God. This increased amount of suffering led me to question myself. And I didn't have a way to deal with it, cope with it, manage it at all. And it got to the point where I was struggling a lot with, suicidal ideations, struggling with PTSD that bad that I eventually got to the point in 2016 where I had enough. It's been 2 years now struggling with PTSD and all this stuff and everything on the, relationship issues, and nothing was going well. And it got to the point where I got to like the end of my rope. Here comes another little like coincidental story. I was dead set on wanting to take my own life. It was November 29, 2016. I still remember the date because the date plays into what I now know to be God's providence and sovereignty. It was November 29, 2016. I went home after work one day and I was just so sick and tired of it all, everything I was going through. I had false accusations made against me, and so I had a whole like court case that was going on for like 16, 17 months investigation that I finally won and had everything dismissed and I could breathe. It was like a breath of fresh air. But then the military, like 2 months later, decides to backdoor it and pull like a double jeopardy thing. If they won't, charge you on the civilian side, then we're going to do it here on the military side. And it was just totally like bogus, and it made me very angry and embittered. My ex-wife was like really trying to get me out of the picture as she was developing her affair further. And it was like really like a way to kind of like a chess game for custody is really what it was. But when I was fed up, went home, got my pistol, and I was dead set on taking my own life. That's how bad this PTSD struggle had gotten. And I had been doing a lot of counseling up until this point. I had done 2 years of counseling, which doesn't sound like a lot, but here's just for context. Most people who go to counseling, they'll do one visit with their clinician a week.
Yeah.
It's about an hour a week. And so if you don't miss a single week, and if you have one even through the holiday weeks, you got 52 hours, 52 weeks. I was doing in 1 week about 18 to 22 hours.
It's like a part-time job.
Yeah, it was
That's
intensive.
wild.
It was at a hospital setting. It was in clinic settings. It was in one-on-one settings, in group settings. And it's just because the military, especially in special operations, they really want to get you back to being mentally healthy so that
Yeah.
you can be combat ready again.
Right.
So they really bring in all these resources. The military itself doesn't really know how to deal with it, which is why they have this separate department
Yeah.
of behavioral mental health with all these professionals. And so they kind of like, we don't know how to like deal with you. So just, this is going to be your work now. You
Yeah.
have to go get mentally healthy.
Wow.
And so that's how much counseling I was doing. I added it up one time. I was like, how much am I doing in a week, per year, and everything? It essentially, in a span of 2.5 years, it ends up being about 10 years, a session a
Wow.
week. It would take them 10 years to get that kind of hours.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it is intensive, and it's like, it's broad, but not really making any headway. So really frustrated with everything. And on this particular day, I was dead set of like taking my own life. I'm in the middle of preparing everything, and I have a pistol, a loaded pistol in my hand. I'm not a believer yet. This is 2016, but I've had all those combat experiences that caused me to question. And I had this strong urge, not to sound charismatic, but it was almost like something like really impressing upon me.
Oh, yeah.
Don't do it, not until you listen to a sermon. And I thought, what in the world?
And
To
was
be with
that
friends.
an urge, or was it like kind of an audible voice, or kind of what?
It was kind of an audible voice,
Kind
and not
of?
my own.
No.
That's great.
And it was like to stop me.
Yeah.
And it's like, listen to a sermon.
That's wild.
I was a little bit going to church. One of my friends was inviting me because he knew everything I was going through. So I would go to this really like loosey-goosey non-denominational church with him and his wife and kid, and it was just nice. And this is the only church that I know to listen to because I don't know any other church. I'm only going to this one with my friend and his family. So I'm like, okay. And it's like a Wednesday. I'm like, there is no church on a Wednesday. And so I was like, oh, but there's a sermon archive. There's a sermon library. And it's like, well, what sermon do I pick? I'm thinking to myself. It's like, well, today's November 29th. Why don't you just watch the sermon in the archive that falls on November 29th. I'm like, well, today's Wednesday. What are the odds that it does actually fall on a Sunday. So it's the November 29th sermon of the previous year.
Oh, wow.
And I listened to it. The sermon is based on the scripture, Jeremiah 29:11. Now, I know a lot of cultural Christianity. They love that verse. Oh,
Yeah.
God's
Know the
had plans
plans
for
I have
me.
for you.
Yeah.
I know the plans I have for you.
But I thought it was odd that today is the 29th day of the 11th month, and I'm watching a sermon of the previous year on Jeremiah 29:11. And the whole message was premised on whatever it is that you're going through, the Lord still has a plan and a purpose for you. Which is exactly what I needed to hear in that moment. Because I was like, there is no plan and purpose.
Yeah, you had a plan.
Oh, I had a plan.
God had a different plan.
So I listened to the whole sermon all the way through while I'm on my phone and a still loaded pistol in my hand. I get to the end of it and I'm just like a wreck. And I'm just like, I take the thing and I just like chuck it back into the drawer and I stop. And that convicted me so much. I was like, and I stopped. And I still don't become a Christian, mind you. I'm that stubborn, right? But I mean, now I'm just like, okay, combat experiences, stuff that's going on, and now this supernatural prevention of suicide, really you can call it. I was like, I definitely have to be wrong.
About something.
Yeah.
Right.
About
at
a
that
lot
point.
of things. But I can't bring myself to say that God exists.
Right.
And of course not, because faith is not something that we conjure up ourselves.
Yeah.
But at this point, it's just it's breaking down pretty much every single wall and barrier that I had ever since I was 11 years old.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like that's a lot to break down at that level.
It was at that point in 2016 where I would affirm God's existence, but I wasn't truly a Christian. I hadn't been regenerated, hadn't been born again. He hadn't changed me. I was still living my life however I wanted to, but with this new acknowledgement of okay, God exists. So if anyone asks me, I'm going to say, yeah, God's real.
Yeah. Do we want to pause briefly? Because Alex is struggling with some of our background technology.
I'm so glad this camera is just continuing on like nothing's going on.
He's
But
soldiering
this
on. He's
camera
doing his darndest.
overheated, and I think that camera ran out of memory.
It's funny you mentioned the you're talking about hearing the voice of God, getting this strong impression. The last 2 episodes ago, we talked with my dad, and my dad's a Reformed pastor, so he's not a Pentecostal hippy dippy, getting feelings from the Lord kind of guy. But he was saying we sell the supernatural short sometimes in the Reformed world. We really do. We have this sense of oh yeah, God's gonna speak to me through the scriptures and the creeds and the confessions, and that's it. God's not allowed to basically be supernatural.
Yeah.
And I think he's 100% right that is an unhealthy attitude. Just because we don't believe we're getting new revelations from God doesn't mean that God isn't still revealing himself, not in a canonical sense that we're getting new books and prophecies necessarily.
Exactly.
I consider myself a cessationist in that sense, but not a hardcore cessationist. Soft cessationism is the phrase I've heard. I like that because it acknowledges that God is still supernatural.
Yeah.
In the West, we don't see a lot of the supernatural, I think. But, I mean, there's people like missionaries overseas who are talking about their experiences in non-Western context with the things they see of the spiritual world. And it's okay, maybe we're more materialist than we think we are in the West, which is not a great thought because, how are you going to fight the spiritual battles you're dealing with if you're assuming that they don't really exist? So, food for thought for me. For me, for sure.
Definitely that cultural context affects our own perspective. And we do fall into an anti-supernaturalism.
Well, I remember I was reading about the early church, the pagan, the contemporary pagans in early Christianity. The idea that Jesus rose from the dead, the philosophers thought that was dumb. But the average pagan was oh, sure, for whatever. But your God died. That's low-key cringe. What's with that? That was their problem. Their problem was that Christianity said you had to be nice to poor people. Why would we be nice to poor people? We should be nice to strong people because they're cooler than everyone else. And it's so fascinating as Westerners, we don't even realize how influenced we are by Christian thought and just the assumptions of supernaturalism or anti-supernaturalism. And, okay, I want to respect your time. We've been talking for a while. You don't have a curfew?
No,
this
good.
might
We
be
could talk until.
if we keep going with this could be
We'll
2
just have dinner.
episodes easily. Yeah, this could be 2 episodes easily.
Honestly, it could. We've
'Cause-
already gotten an hour in.
I
Yeah.
didn't realize it was that long.
Hey guys, this is Alex Sikma. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. And yep, we decided to cut it here. If you are interested in hearing more of Matthew's story, where we get a little bit further, dive a little bit further into his counseling and mental health experience, make sure to check out part 2, releasing next week. Catch you on the flip side. Thank you for listening to the Disruption Podcast, where we disrupt the culture and center Christ. If you enjoyed the show, please consider subscribing on YouTube or following us on Spotify. You can also follow us on Instagram. We'll see you on the next episode.